Okay, in this lecture, in this teaching module, we're going to look at economic growth in historical perspective. Economic growth in historical perspective. We'll start with economic growth per person. This comes from Bradford DeLong at University of California, Berkeley. The historical perspective of economic growth over time. We'll start with here, under this period of hard despotism. You had the divine right to rule of the church and the crown, and it was a mercantilism where the state decided imports and exports, suppress the living standards of people in order to export more for gold, get that gold back into the coffers of the church and the state and the crown so that they can fight religious and territorial wars. Then you have the Enlightenment, which was the rights of the individual as opposed to the rights of the state, the divine right to rule, or hard despotism. So you have a reaction, the Enlightenment, against the divine right to rule. And that's best exemplified in the English language by Adam Smith's book. In 1776, he says in that book that the way nations become wealthy and individuals become wealthy is through free trade. So that was a big changing in the consciousness of people. I'm talking about Europe now, Europe and the United States. With Adam Smith's, you get the Enlightenment where it becomes no longer the divine right to rule, but the rights of the individual, or the Enlightenment, classical liberalism. So what happens, you get basically no economic growth until around 1800. Then between 1800 and 1900, economic growth per person increases 300%. With the Enlightenment, with free trade, the gold standard, and the rule of law, you're getting early capitalism, economic growth and wealth creation and reduction in poverty. People are living longer, healthier, wealthier, more thriving lives due to these institutions of early capitalism based on the Enlightenment, which is free trade, the gold standard, and the rule of law. Then between 1900 and 2000, you get 1,000% growth per person, right? So this early capitalism through modern capitalism, you're getting much capital accumulation and economic growth and increasing standards of living and more healthy lives due to the Enlightenment and the institutions which were created under the Enlightenment. And then everything changed. So then, of course, you have World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. And this World War I, Great Depression, and the New Deal in the United States, and World War II, that brings us war socialism and the modern welfare state. So the biggest example of that, everything changed in 2008 due to the 2007 to the housing boom and bust, and then you had huge interventions into the economy at that time. So now you're getting less economic growth than you did under early capitalism and modern capitalism. Now we've got some people like myself say we're in a period of political capitalism, where everything changed due to the great massive bailouts of 2008, 2009, 2010. And of course that's got even worse with the COVID bailouts. So that's economic growth per person over time in perspective, historical perspective. So, and this is from Edward Nell. This is the government burden over time in historical perspective. Under hard despotism, the state, the church and the crown would pull off 40% of the gold coming in from the Americas. The ships would come in, the state would take 40% off the top. That's called hard despotism. Then you have the Enlightenment, and then early capitalism. And we're calling early capitalism the period between classical liberal period of history, classical liberalism, between the end of slavery in the United States and World War I. Now, early capitalism is when you had all the great capital accumulation and growth, which set the base for all the economic growth of the 20th century. And this early capitalism was based on classical liberal institutions. Classical liberal institutions let's start with the gold standard. After the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire, you had decentralized, estate-based, manorial-based economies, and this was prior to the nation state. The nation state really didn't come into the fore of people's consciousness until World War I. So as the state is building itself, leading to World War I, the trade during the medieval period was based on the gold standard. Gold became the medium of exchange around Europe and into the United States, based on the gold standard. And the state then, once they tried to grow their power, the nation state had to accept the gold standard, meaning that the state had to exchange their paper money for gold and gold for paper money. So you had a gold standard, and that meant that the government couldn't tax much more than it spent. The government couldn't spend much more than it taxed, because they couldn't print money to cover and run up debt to cover the deficit, because they had to exchange gold for paper and paper for gold. So the gold standard kept, under early capitalism, the state to around 5% of the economy. And again, these are stylized facts. It varied in different places, of course, but the stylized fact in general, what we're looking at is the West. And then again, based on Adam Smith, free trade. So the state is now only 5% of the economy, so you're getting free trade. You're not getting the mercantilism of the divine right to rule. So you also have the rule of law. So the rule of law was basically a negative rights rule of law, meaning that it was the protection of property rights to facilitate trade. If there was a violation of property rights, the state court system, and you couldn't work it out voluntarily, the state's role under the rule of law was to negotiate property rights to facilitate trade. And this early classical liberal period all ended in 1914, when England pulled out of the gold standard in order to spend much more than they tax, in order to fight World War I. So the classical liberal period of history ended with World War I, when England pulls out of the gold standard. And then you have, in 1930, you have huge trade barriers placed in, so that's the end of free trade during the Depression, during the nationalism like we've got today, a lot of nationalism and trade barriers. And then under the war socialism, and especially in the United States with the New Deal, the rule of law changes, where you're getting administrative law. For example, instead of the legislature passing laws and the court enforcing them based on a rule of law, based on contract law, you're getting a lot of, I call it death by 1,000 cuts, where the legislature will pass a law and then the administration will administer it. So you start getting a lot more discretionary power under the rule of law. You're allowing the state to build up its size because they no longer are on the gold standard, so they can run up debt and print money. And so that then allows the state to go back up to 40%. And that's called soft despotism, where you have, it's not a divine right to rule, but due to administrative law and discretionary power, you're no longer getting the free trade and the factor mobility, which allows all the economic growth and reduction in absolute poverty. And then again, everything changed in 2008 with the bailouts. So many people are calling our current period, especially with the COVID situation and those bailouts, essential services and businesses, and the state determining with discretionary power who gets special treatment under rule of law. And that was really predominant. The buildup of administrative law was really predominant in the 1930s, which then leads up to the state today. And then the decreased rates of economic growth we're experiencing today. So thank you. That completes the teaching module on economic growth and historical perspective. Thank you.